Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Actually scheduled this episode before Monday's breaking news that Malik Reneau had committed to Indiana, but no better person to talk just about the busy day yesterday and what's been a pretty eventful spring so far for Indiana basketball than our good friend Galen Clavio, one of the hosts of CrimsonCast. I like to call him one of the founding fathers of IU podcasting. Galen, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. It's been too long since we talked to you.
It feels like a yearly April tradition at this point, Alex. So, no, it's great to be back. Happy to talk to you again. And a happy week so far for IU basketball. And we'll take all of those that we can get.
It's also a little 5 week in Bloomington. So a lot of fun things going on there.
Yeah, it's cold today. We're recording this on Tuesday. I think it was 34 when I woke up, and it's going to be like 81 for the men's race on Saturday. So Bloomington, as the kids say, is going to be lit, and it's going to be an interesting week.
So the news yesterday, obviously, Malik Reneau commits to Indiana. Big picture, what does this mean, in your opinion, for just kind of what Mike Woodson's been able to do from a recruiting perspective, and then also next year's team? It still seems like there's some outstanding housekeeping that needs to be done with the roster. We'll get to some of those things kind of coming up, but just Reneau, what's the impact, do you think, for the program?
Well, it's very positive impact. I mean, a 6'8" lefty who has good court vision and scores, almost at will. I mean, anybody's going to want to bring that sort of a player in. A top 30 player, another one for Mike Woodson, and a teammate of a player he's already got coming in, who's also very highly regarded in Jalen Hood-Schifino. I look at it and I say, from a recruiting perspective, Mike Woodson is making a lot of positive waves in a way that perhaps some people didn't think he'd be able to when he took over the job. I think the concern, and I certainly count myself in this, maybe less concern and more just I was in a prove it to me mode. You always worry if you're going to hire a 60-something-year-old coach who's never coached in college before, even if he's got extensive NBA experience, how much will that actually translate on the recruiting trail? A lot of NBA ex-coaches who come to college have tended to slack on the recruiting trail. And, whether that's Chris Mullen at St. John's or whether that's Eddie Jordan at Rutgers. I mean, there have been a lot of examples of that. And it just doesn't feel that way with Mike Woodson right now. Whatever he's selling these players on is resonating with them. And I think you see that in the recruits he was able to pull in for this cycle, the recruits that he's been able to pull in for the future cycles, and just the caliber and type of player that seems to be interested in Indiana right now feels like a step above in terms of athleticism from what Archie Miller was pulling in. And I think that that's a key, because I think what Mike Woodson's been able to do is basically go to recruits and go to parents and say, look, I'm very familiar with what it takes to get to the NBA, and I can help to get you there. And that's worked with the players that were here at IU. He gets Trace Jackson-Davis to come back last year. He may get him to come back again this year. He seems to be getting players both here and as recruits to believe that he can help them get to the next level. And that feels like something Indiana's missed for a long time. I mean, certainly Archie Miller brought in some high-level recruits, not that many of them panned out. Tom Crean certainly brought in recruits. He had kind of a mixed bag results combination on some of them. But Woodson has come in and made a lot of noise relatively quickly on the recruiting trail. And I think at least on that front, it points towards positive things for the program.
Yeah, I think one of the things that he's done a good job of is putting the right infrastructure and staff that can kind of get the program involved with these recruits. And then when they brings them on campus, he's the de facto closer, and he's able to make that impression. It was interesting when Brian Walsh, the new assistant coach, had his media availability a couple weeks ago. He talked about kind of in his former role, and now even more so, I guess, as an assistant coach, he was doing a lot of things behind the scenes as a recruiting coordinator. And he talked about how, they basically were setting things up for Coach Woodson so that when, they would get in the door with the kid and they would build the relationship. And then when the player got on campus, he said, Coach Woodson's the closer. And I think that's kind of where having the right plan in place to how you're going to identify kids, how you're going to build that initial relationship, maybe through your assistant coaching staff or your support staff, and then the head coach. I think the one thing that you consistently hear when you talk to people about Mike Woodson, I talked to Malik Reneau yesterday, and he talked about just having a real conversation with Coach Woodson and what he was able to tell him. Going back to when Trace Jackson Davis decided to come back, he talked about Woodson telling him maybe not the things that he wanted to hear, but the things that he needed to hear. And so I think the strength of Woodson, maybe from a recruiting perspective, is just being able to connect on a one-on-one basis with a kid and get him to buy into that vision. And that's, to me, is the most impressive thing that he's been able to show here in the first, 13 months on the job, is being able to kind of be that Mariano Rivera, so to speak. He the bullpen gets the game to him, and then he's able to close the deal. Yeah,
and that's I think it was an open question coming into Woodson's time about how well that would resonate, and I think he's certainly got a good staff around him. There were some questions initially about what the composition was going to look like, and obviously there's been a change on the staff with Fife leaving, but you take the Fife piece out of it. I mean, because it doesn't really seem to have mattered. They got good recruits last year. They were able to stabilize that class. They've been able to get good recruits, into the new year, and that is, I think, pretty impressive, because ultimately, when you look at Indiana and you look at what they've done over the last decade in college basketball, it's always felt like the rosters that have been put together have been somewhat incomplete. And I've had a question on that front with both Crean and with Archie Miller about, how much are these guys really appealing to the types of players that you need to be contending for Big Ten titles and for national championships. And that's not just a Crean or Miller thing. It's also what staff was around them and what were they selling the recruits on. And so you think about all the players that we've seen that IU was in the hunt for over the last decade, who have been key pieces on teams that have made Final Fours and won national titles. We don't know yet, what the recruiting yield's going to be for IU. But it does feel like they're starting to win some of those battles that we've wanted them to win over the course of the last decade. And certainly the other component of that is getting them out on the floor and having them produce regularly. But you got to have the talent first before you can actually get the talent utilized properly. And so I am really pleased about that. And I'm pleased that this assistant recruiting core has been able to do as much as they've done, given the lack of success, relatively speaking, that IU's had over the last decade.
The most difficult thing tamar forward is how to project what these guys are actually going to do when they hit the court, because you can, the last two 5-star recruits that Indiana got, Christian Lander and Tamar Bates, Lander obviously played a couple seasons and is now out the door. It seems like he's going to transfer to a lower level than the Power 5 level. I don't want to go over why Christian Lander didn't work out at Indiana, but we obviously all saw what he was able to produce. And Tamar Bates, I think the jury's kind of still out there in terms of what type of player he's going to become. So you've got a lot of excitement now with the fan base. Jalen Hood-Schifino's coming in. He's a 5-star recruit. Malik Reneau coming in next season as a 5-star. And I don't want to diminish people's expectations for next season, but also from a realistic perspective, it's not 100% hit rate with these guys in terms of them coming in immediately and producing. What do you think are fair expectations for this recruiting class coming into next season, and how important is it going to be to have the right kind of surrounding cast around them in order to be able to go back to the tournament again next season?
As my podcast partner, Scott Caulfield, regularly reminds everybody, he doesn't really follow recruiting that closely because it's a crapshoot as far as what sort of output you're going to get from players. And he's right. I mean, as much as we get tied up in rankings and video of players at the high school level or an AAU ball or what have you, it's fun. It's something that has been a constant around IU basketball since recruiting services really kicked up about 20 years ago. But you think of the number of players, not just at Indiana, but everywhere else, that have high rankings and then don't necessarily pan out. It's pretty significant. You've got to temper your expectations a little bit. I think every recruit's a little bit different. I think certainly it just feels like Lander was never physically or mentally ready for this level. and it almost felt like he got bad advice about reclassifying and coming out when he did. With Bates, I have a hard time having a complete set of judgment on him because he came into a very unsettled situation with a poorly constructed roster, which really wasn't Mike Woodson's fault. And it's tough to settle in as a player when your teammates don't necessarily know where they're supposed to be or what they're supposed to be doing, and you're still trying to figure out a new offensive system. I think Bates showed flashes, but he certainly wasn't a plug and play, 10 point per game player coming in as a freshman. I think a lot of people thought that he would be. So that's a good example of a player that I think's a good player who can probably develop into something potentially special for IU, but it's going to take a year or two for him to really get settled and have the pieces around him. Now for Hood Schifino and Reneau, I like the situation that they are potentially coming into this upcoming year better than I like what Tamar Bates came into last year. And this is where I think IU fans have we've seen them struggle so much with watching so much roster turnover and watching rosters not develop into cohesive units. The hope is that you plug those players plus CJ Gunn plus Caleb Banks into a roster that knows what it's doing a lot better than what it was doing last year. You have an established point guard in Xavier Johnson. You could potentially have both Race Thompson and Trace Jackson Davis back. You've got players that have played together in this particular system offensively and defensively. That makes it a lot easier for a young player to come in, find a role, and contribute, as opposed to being part of a large group of people all trying to find their roles. And I think when we look at the difference between Indiana and programs like Michigan State or Villanova, who have been able to take high-level recruits and have them come in and perform right away, it's because there's an infrastructure around them. And so I like the fact that there seems to be an infrastructure being built. Certainly this last year wasn't perfect. There's a lot that needed to be tweaked and fixed in terms of how IU played, especially on offense. But it's a much better situation now than it was last year. I'm not expecting, miracles out of either of these particular recruits, but I do think that they'll be in a better position.
So what's the balance, in your opinion, going forward in terms of how to use the transfer portal and how to use recruiting high school players? Because we saw with the portal this past season, I know Parker Stewart was kind of already here, but he had flaws obviously in his game, but he was somebody that Mike Woodson kind of rode with the whole season. He's obviously moving on. Michael Durr, came in, didn't really produce at any meaningful level. There was an argument maybe to be made that they would have been better off keeping Joey Brunk within the program than moving to Michael Durr. And then you've got Miller Kopp, who came in, who by all accounts is sticking with the program for another season. But you still have this thing out there now where Indiana's looking at some guys from the portal. We don't know necessarily where those spots are going to come from. And I think there's kind of a balance that needs to be struck here between continuity and developing some of these younger players like a Trey Galloway, like a Jordan Geronimo, like an Anthony Leal, and also bringing in guys that you feel like from the portal can help you win games next season. I just don't know that it's conducive to long-term success if you're bringing in 2 or 3 portal guys every season at the expense of maybe suppressing some of the younger players. Where do you kind of come in on that? And moving forward, more specifically to this season, obviously Trace is kind of the outstanding decision there. If he comes back, there's really not a spot to be had on the roster, at least on paper.
Right. Well, one thing I think it's important for us to keep in mind is that we never have complete information about what's going on behind the scenes. There's the news that the player from Wichita State, Dennis, is in town and IU's looking at them closely. I have a sneaking suspicion that they're not bringing that type of a player in unless they know that there's going to be an opening on the roster. And you might have a player who hasn't put their name in the portal but is planning to and is just essentially waiting on timing to do it. I don't think that this era, you're never going to get full information as a media member or a fan. You're going to have to essentially just follow along and try to put pieces together. And I think that's essentially what's going on here. I'm a little bit, I think I take a little bit of a different approach than you in terms of the developmental piece, because as we've seen at IU in particular, you just can't count on your players developing over the course of a 4-year span of time. You go back and look at the recruits that came in that were top-level players or considered top-level players under Archie Miller, and precious few of them, either here or elsewhere after transferring, ever really developed into a top-level player. I mean, Rob Finney obviously hit some big individual shots in a couple of games and was a really good defender, but just never developed an offensive game that allowed him to stay on the floor as a Big Ten point guard. You've got guys like Demezy Anderson, who transferred twice and didn't play at all at his second stop. You got there's those sorts of experiences, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but I think as a college coach in this era, it's hard to say, well, I'm just going to stick with the guys that I've got in the locker room regardless and just trust their development, when there are players that are already at a certain level of development that are willing to come to your school and you can plug in and play. And I think for someone like Mike Woodson, who's from the NBA, who's used to plugging in pieces that weren't there the previous year as free agents, who's used to trying to figure out rotations based upon things and factors outside of his control, maybe using the portal as a greater tool for roster development is a better idea than relying on incoming freshmen. Because, even as we talked about with some of the 5-stars that IU's had over the course of the last decade, even a 5-star coming in is not a guarantee that they're going to be scoring in double figures or being able to play, 15, 20 minutes or more a game, let alone slide into the starting lineup. Whereas you might be able to bring somebody in that could do that, who's, already knows what it's like to play college basketball. As you mentioned, some of the transfer experiences IU's had haven't been that successful here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the process is bad. It might just mean that the players that came in weren't capable of living up to the spot that everybody expected them to. So I think that means you have to just do a better job of getting the right types of players in at that stage. It's a tricky calculus, and it's one of those calculuses that I think the next really successful group of college basketball coaches will have figured out, where it's like, okay, I've got my top recruits or guys that I really believe in that are going to come in, but I'm not going to be afraid to go grab players that have developed at other schools and plug them into the system that I've got, because I'll be able to be successful with those types of players.
So as we sit here on the morning of April 19th, 2022, fully knowing that this probably isn't the roster that Indiana is going to roll into next season with, what do you see as kind of the biggest holes in the roster as it stands today, and what, if anything, would you like to see addressed? Is it simply perimeter shooters, guys that can, but that's the kind of the thing I go back to the portal last offseason. It was like, all right, Parker Stewart and Miller Copper coming in, they can shoot outside. Of course they can shoot outside at a decent percentage, but did they do enough else on the court to kind of justify the minutes that they received? That's up for interpretation. So I'm just kind of curious from your perspective where you would like to see upgrades maybe to the current roster, and what specific areas do you think need to be addressed?
I mean, from my perspective, given what we saw out of the way that this team played this year, certainly they need to continue to try to get better shooting from outside and having players that are threats out there. And that is a tricky proposition. I'll use examples of what happened to Indiana going the opposite direction last year, where Al Durham, who was a pretty good three-point shooter, transfers to Providence, has a really good final year of college basketball, but his three-point percentage dropped from like close to 40% to 22 or 23% on the season. There's a lot of variables that are hard to predict with this stuff. I think that Indiana, if they've really got, and we'll just for the moment assume Trace Jackson Davis is back, if they've got Xavier Johnson, Trace Jackson Davis, and Race Thompson as, kind of the three pillars of the team coming back, then certainly you look there and you say, all right, the 2, 3, and 4 positions, you're going to have players that can shoot the ball better than Miller Kopp and Parker Stewart did last year over the bulk of the season. They both shot pretty well in the non-conference, and then defenses kind of figured them out as they got into conference play. So you're going to have people that can contribute on that front. I think you need to figure out if the answer as a backup point guard is it Trey Galloway? Is it Jalen Hood-Schifino? Like, what are you going to do with the ball handling position when Xavier Johnson isn't in the ball game? And if you're going to run again with Trace Jackson Davis and Race Thompson, can you come up with a more effective rotation in the post than what they were doing last year for most of the season, where Michael Durr gave you some ineffective minutes for the most part. And Jordan Geronimo, while he played really well in spurts, was also pretty inconsistent in the middle portion of the Big Ten season. And I think that hurt Indiana in some of those games. So to me, it's like, Woodson does seem to like, that kind of quasi positionless basketball where you could have a guy that you could switch from the 2 to the 3 or the 3 to the 4. You could change the configurations of the lineup. You could switch people around and still get some outside shooting. So if you could target players that are 6'5" or better, that have a record of shooting pretty well from 18 feet and out, that to me is what's going to bulk this team up and make them stronger, because you're going to need those players to pull defenders off of Johnson and off of Trayce Jackson-Davis and Race Thompson. If you might be able to do that with the players that are currently on the roster. Tamar Bates is probably going to get significantly better in the offseason. So I look right now and I say, if they went in with just this roster, they'd be in pretty good shape. I think they'd be in contention for a top 4 position in the conference. I think they'd be in position to be a top 20 team. If they can add more productive depth or even a starter at the 2 or the 3 that could come right in with a proven track record, that raises the floor of the season and the ceiling for that matter.
Trayce Jackson-Davis obviously is still kind of going through the process. He's in the beginning stages of going through the pre-draft process. And I'm actually kind of surprised that he didn't do this in the previous years, because it's kind of a risk-free assessment. I mean, think about an internship as a college student. You go and you kind of go out there and you learn about where you are as in the business world or as a broadcaster, or and you kind of get feedback and what you have to work on. And Trayce hasn't done this the past 2 years. So I really think it's smart that he's doing this. What ultimately do you think this is going to come down to? Is it going to be, can you get the NIL package, quote unquote package, that is enticing enough to bring him back? Is it just whether or not he's going to get picked in a position that he feels comfortable that he can earn his way in onto an NBA team? What do you think this ultimately comes down to? And if you're him, what are the factors that you're weighing when deciding what to do? Because I wonder, by coming back, how he can actually improve his draft stock, because he's another year older. We know that the NBA, once you get to be 22, 23, they're like, wow, this is 3 or 4 years of wasted development that we could have had you in our system. And okay, maybe he can go from being the 52nd pick to the 35th pick if he comes back and takes IU to a Final Four and Elite Eight and has a really good year. I just wonder, is it ultimately going to come down to if he can, get enough NIL money to come back to Bloomington?
I mean, I think that's part of it. And look, there's financial ramifications with these sorts of decisions. I think with Trayce Jackson-Davis, this year was a really interesting one, because all of the indications when he came back last year were that Mike Woodson had told him what he needed to work on with his game and was going to work on that part of the game with him. And that was going to lead to, one more year at IU and then off to whatever professional land he was in. But keep in mind, when that decision was made, there was no NIL allowed. That happened that following summer. And what's interesting about the way that the season worked out this year was that we really didn't see Trayce Jackson-Davis change the basics of his game. We saw him get more efficient, which I think is a key aspect of what he's doing. I mean, you look at the stats from last year to this year. He shot 52% from 2 during his second year at IU. And then this past year, he shot almost 60% from 2. He dropped his turnover percentages by a point. He increased his rebounding percentages on the defensive boards. He really did turn himself into a far more efficient version of himself the previous year. Now, that's probably not enough to get him drafted, but I think, as you said, it makes sense to go through the process and see what's there. I'm actually kind of surprised he didn't put his name in the transfer portal, because and then this to me is a little bit of an insight into the psychological influences on Trayce Jackson-Davis, because I think it's clear that he doesn't want to be somewhere else in college. He feels like if he stays, he's going to get what he needs from a coaching perspective, where he'll be in as good of a position for going pro in whatever league as he would be if he went somewhere else. And that, I think, was an open question. Like, it felt like, especially in the Big Ten season, he might say, well, I want to stay for another year in college, but I'm going to do it somewhere where I've got a clear launch pad to the NBA. That doesn't appear to be happening, because I think the transfer portal deadline is like this week or something like that. So the fact that it seems to be, I'm either going to go pro or stay at Indiana, says a lot about whatever Mike Woodson's messaging is to Trayce Jackson-Davis about his game. I just don't know at this point if Trayce Jackson-Davis is physically or mentally like attuned enough to being able to open out his game and shoot from further outside and develop a three-point shot or develop a long-range jump shot, because that seems to be the one missing piece that most NBA teams are going to look at and say, we can't draft you, or we can't put you on our roster because you don't have that piece of your game. We saw so little of that at any point during the season this past year. I just don't know, like, does he spend the whole offseason working on that if he comes back? Maybe he does. Maybe that ends up being the approach, and maybe he feels like he can do that here and that Woodson can give him the tutelage. I don't know. It's weird that didn't happen this past year, but maybe that just wasn't part of the plan. So, yeah, I think the NIL piece ultimately ends up making it a harder decision than it might have been, because he could have easily just said, well, look, I might as well go try this for a year in the G League or somewhere in Europe and figure out if I can develop that part of my game there where I can just work on it all the time. But if there's going to be financial incentives that are pretty sizable, probably bigger than he would get on any sort of a non-NBA contract to stay at Indiana. And I think that is going to weigh on his decision-making process. But we probably won't know for sure until we get all the way through the draft process. And so I think we're going to be waiting a little bit on figuring out what's going on here.
How are the potential outcomes for next season altered in terms of whether Trayce comes back and whether he doesn't? Is it as drastic as some people would have you believe, or is there a path for Indiana to being as good or better next season if he's not on the roster?
I think they'd be different next year significantly. I don't know that they'd be better. In fact, I would say that they would certainly not be better. A lot of people seem to have gotten their heads wrapped around the idea that IU's roster was going to be in better shape if both Race Thompson and Trayce Jackson-Davis moved on, which I just have never understood from the get-go. I mean, you've got two players with 3+ years of experience, both of whom are your essentially two most efficient scorers. The argument that you shouldn't have those guys on the roster and you want to make way for less experienced players or players that haven't, frankly, proven themselves to that degree has never held much water with me. That, if Trayce Jackson-Davis leaves, you're losing one of the top 150 players in college basketball in terms of offensive efficiency. Yes, he's not the greatest defensive player, but what he showed this year was that he could be one of the best players in terms of blocking shots and protecting the rim in college ball. And that's a piece you definitely want to build around. I think if he stays on the roster and the roster stays as it's currently constituted, or maybe you lose, a player that doesn't play very much and you replace him with a transfer, that's a team that can get to the Sweet 16 and beyond, frankly. There's no reason why they can't. And maybe that's shooting too low. Without Trayce Jackson-Davis, it's hard to project. I think the team could still be good. I just don't know how they look with at that point, is Race Thompson your center? Are you playing essentially without a center? Are you moving more towards a 4-1 or some kind of a 5-out system? That sounds great, except you don't have the shooters to be able to effectively do that at this point. So the way the team is currently constituted, with the lack of any sort of other player to slot into that role and provide even 75% of the scoring and the rim protection, I think it'd be a worse IU team with Trayce Jackson-Davis gone. I think they'd still be a team that could contend. They would just have to metamorphosize a lot.
One thing I've tried to focus on a little bit this offseason, last week we had the executive director of Hoosiers for Good on the podcast, and I know you're at IU and kind of around campus and know a little bit about this topic. And what from your perspective, opportunities currently exist for IU student athletes in the NIL space, and are they comparable to what is available at other schools? It seems like we're still kind of missing some information just and I think that some of that is by design. Some people would say, well, it's none of your business in terms of what deals guys are getting. We hear details of different deals being agreed to, but there's no dollar figures attached to it. I'm just kind of curious if you have any perspective or insight as to what, and I'm not speaking specifically to Trace Jackson Davis, but in general, do you feel like the opportunities from an NIL perspective at Indiana are comparable to what's happening in other places, or do you think there's still room to grow?
I think in basketball, they're comparable. Now, they're not as public. You've seen a lot of schools come out with these grandiose NIL collectives. Like I think Notre Dame just announced one yesterday that's like being partially run by Brady Quinn. Texas has really made a lot of noise on this. And I think it's important for people to keep in mind that there's a lot of bravado that goes along with those announcements. It's meant to be something where, a high school junior or senior making a decision and be like, ooh, I need to go there because they've got the best NIL thing. Realistically, I think for players that come here, they're going to be taken care of. It's just being done in a little bit of a quieter manner with IU. But a lot of the deals that are being done, I just don't think are being publicized the way that we're seeing stuff getting publicized at other schools. But IU's right in the mix. And there's a lot of businesses and organizations in Indianapolis and elsewhere in the state and in the region that I think are engaging in things, but it doesn't necessarily need to be publicized to the degree that it's being publicized elsewhere. I do think that as we move forward, you're going to see these sorts of organizational structures around NIL become more and more public. This is going to be kind of part of the mix. I think Indiana's taking a more reserved approach on this because the NCAA really is unhappy about the way that NIL has unfolded, because their big assurance to everybody was that, well, we're not going to tie NIL to coming to a school and playing sports there. Like it can't be a quid pro quo for enrollment and for, signing a scholarship deal. And yet that's the way a lot of schools are operating. And I think IU's like, well, we can do that. We're just not going to publicize it in the way that some of the SEC schools and some other schools in the country are doing it until we get some more clarity on how accepted this is going to be from a rules perspective. And, so right now it's the Wild West. And I think at least on the basketball side, IU players are being taken care of from an NIL perspective, both in terms of big deals and in terms of smaller deals. It almost feels like the smaller deals are the ones that are getting all the attention, while the big deals may not actually be getting much publicity at all.
Do you think that's a smart approach to kind of suppress the publicity around that? Because, like, for example, with Kentucky last season, we saw Ty Washington post an Instagram picture with a Porsche. One of the Louisville players that just came back, I think his name's Sidney Curry, who was one of their better players last season, had something on Twitter about he just got a Jeep. And some of these things, I think from a fan perspective, the fan base sees these things and they say, well, what's Indiana doing? And you're telling me that these guys are being taken care of behind the scenes and there's things going on. I'm just kind of curious. Do you think, you mentioned the NCAA not being happy about this? Do you think it kind of comes down to that in terms of why Indiana doesn't want it more public? It kind of seems like, to me, to be advantageous to get as much stuff out there, because that can only kind of bolster your thing. Indiana's been kind of behind, not just Indiana, the Big Ten. When you look at the recruiting in college basketball, look at the McDonald's All-American game rosters, for example. All these guys are going to SEC schools, and we don't have to be naive about it. We know in many cases why these guys are making these decisions to go to these schools. It's not because Auburn has some rich basketball tradition that people want to go play to. It's the best opportunity for them to maybe capitalize in terms of being paid. And so that's the reality of the game. So my only question in terms of not getting out in front of this and making it kind of a central thing is you run the risk of maybe falling behind in some of these situations. So I'm curious, do you think that's something that has a chance to shift over time, or do you think Indiana's conservative approach is something we're going to see continue for the years to come?
It's a complicated issue because, you're right. First of all, in this huge talent disparity, there was that Fox College Hoops graphic yesterday that listed the players in the NBA playoffs by the conference that they played in. And, the SEC had 59 players in the playoffs. The ACC had 50. Big Ten had 28. And the only major conference that had fewer players in the NBA playoffs was the Big East, and they had 24. So certainly I get where you're coming from. I think that, for Indiana, whatever they're publicly saying, there's apparently stuff going on privately, because much as you just said, I don't think you're pulling in 2 5-star recruits in 2022 without some kind of behind the scenes NIL deals helping to pave the way. And that's fine. And I think the problem is, I say that, and I'm sure there's some fans in your audience who are recoiling a little bit internally about that. So for Indiana, it's tough because of all the fan bases, IU has this puritanical streak in its fan base where they are aghast at the idea that players might be earning money or that there might be rules being broken. And, you compare like the fan base for Louisville, in the area that you live, and it's like a completely different perspective on things. But that's the perspective that's ruling college basketball right now. And so I think for IU, if Mike Woodson and his staff can carry the message effectively to players that, we got plenty of great opportunities available for you here, and things are going to be taken care of. And I don't know if that's actually what's being said. I'm just hypothesizing here. Don't quote me on any of this. That is effective on the recruiting trail because we're seeing the results right now. And I don't think that people are just coming because they're really fired up about Mike Woodson as a coach. Not that they shouldn't be, but there's always more to it. And so that would be my perspective on it right now. For IU, I think you've got to gradually acclimate your fans to the reality that this is what college basketball is. It's been this way for a couple of decades now, but now that it's on the table, we might as well go ahead and get people acclimated to it over time. And so I think within 4 or 5 years, IU is going to be publicly proclaiming the opportunities just like everybody else is. We're just not quite to that point at this stage. And as long as the recruits are coming in and people are getting taken care of and you're able to be competitive on the national recruiting trail, I don't know that the public stance necessarily matters that much.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is I think this new recruiting service that has popped up, On3, I think is what it is. They even have like a ranking of guys in terms of their NIL earnings potential if they go to X, Y, or Z school. So the reality is with NIL, it's not going away. It's here to stay. So whether or not you have to hold your nose and look the other way as a fan is, that's your choice. But for Indiana to be competitive and compete against the schools that they want to compete against, they can't maybe publicly embrace it, but anything that they can do to kind of say we're very friendly to these opportunities is going to be, I think, a big deal moving forward.
And look, a lot of it comes down to the individual player too. We've seen all of these projections on Gabe Cupps being like one of the top 5 players coming into that class in terms of NIL potential. You're going to have a lot of players who bring their own money with them essentially in this process. And then it's like, well, what can you put on top of that? And yeah, we're in an era where a player at least on the basketball side, you could walk away with $1 million, $1.5 million in NIL deals, if you stay for a couple of years. And, that's okay. That's the free market. That's the new system that we're in. And I think, for Indiana fans, and I think Indiana basketball as a whole, it's an adaptation because it's a very different spot to be in from where Indiana's tried to place itself over the last 5 decades or so. But as I like to remind everybody, Indiana, like the whole idea of, we don't cheat, we don't pay players, all of that was a Bob Knight era phenomenon that kind of outlasted Bob Knight. It's not the history of Indiana basketball as a whole. You go back to the Branch McCracken era, and Indiana they are out there, getting in the mix for services with the Kansases and the North Carolinas and the UCLAs. That's just how business is generally done. And so I'm not nearly as morally outraged by the whole process as some people are, but it's just going to take a while for people to get themselves warmed up to it at this point.
Last thing before we get you out here, as many of you know, Galen is the director of the sports media program at Indiana. Obviously, we've had the long-standing relationship of having students write for Inside the Hall, and it's amazing. I was going through the other day as I talked to some prospective candidates for next season, kind of going through the list of students that have written for Inside the Hall, and I continue to be just really impressed with the quality of work that they're able to do. I'm just kind of curious if you can speak to what's kind of going on with the sports media program right now, any big picture things that you're excited about moving forward, and just if you want to say a couple words about Grace, who's obviously going to be moving on. She did a terrific job. Tyler Tashman, also a great job for Inside the Hall this season. I'm just kind of curious, big picture, IU sports media, where's it going? What are you most excited about? And if like I said, if you want to say a couple of words about those two, I thought they did a terrific job this season.
No, I'll start with them. I mean, I think both Grace and Tyler, I really enjoyed all of the coverage that they gave over the course of the season, written coverage, and I had them on the podcast a few times on my end, and always just really enjoy reading what they have to say, talking hoops with them. And look, I knew both of them would be excellent working for Inside the Hall because they've been excellent in everything that they've done throughout their time here. And I'm excited to watch them move on into the profession and really establish themselves as as key members of the basketball media, if that's indeed the direction they go. And hopefully it is, because I think their insights in basketball in particular have been excellent. So it's always a bittersweet time for me this time of year when I work with students like Grace and Tyler, and then they have to move on, and then it's like, well, we got to bring a new group in and work with them on things. And so we've got, I think, a lot of really exciting things moving forward with IU sports media. We continue, the big problem the last couple of years, Alex, and you've experienced this as much as anybody, is the pandemic has just completely upended the way that we do coverage. And I feel terrible for a lot of our students who have been in the program who haven't gotten the full experience that you got in 2017, 2018, 2019. We're really fortunate. We've got over 250 students in the program right now, and that spans everything from writing to broadcasting to production to social media. And we have a great relationship with IU Athletics, where we get to cover, all 24 sports. We get to cover things like Little 500. This week we've got, I think, something like 30 of our sports media students involved in either broadcasting or production of the Little 500 races. You can all check that out live on broadcast.iu.edu. It's probably our favorite thing that we do throughout the course of the year. But, so much of it now is, how do we continue to adapt what we teach students to where the industry is at this point? Now, you started Inside the Hall, was it 15 years now? And you think, 15 years ago, Twitter barely existed, Instagram didn't exist, TikTok didn't exist. People were still primarily buying newspapers and getting their information from there, or watching SportsCenter. And so much of that has changed. And so now, a lot of it is working with our individual student media outlets on, creating smaller bite-sized pieces of content that people can more easily digest on social media, while also doing long-form journalism that really goes in depth and tells stories. And, my message to students is always, you just can't predict how technology is going to change the direction that you're going to take things. So you just need to be prepared for a little bit of everything and be able to adapt as it goes along. And I'm really excited. We have a really deep crop of freshmen coming in this upcoming year who have a lot of experience at the high school level. And, I'm looking forward to plugging them in alongside the students that we've already got, and continuing to try to develop new opportunities for them within the program. So it's a really fun time to be doing this right now.
Yeah. And to kind of build on what you just said, I mean, the one thing I've stressed to all of the students that I've worked with is try to do as many things as possible to prepare yourself for the real world, because if you're going to go into TV broadcasting, that doesn't mean that you don't need to be able to write, because you need to be able to write your scripts for what you're going to say on air, or maybe your TV station wants you to do a podcast or different short types of videos. So as well-rounded as you can get in college, I mean, use it as a time to experiment and do different things. And the more you can do, the more marketable you're going to be, because like you said, it's an unpredictable world out there. My dad started as a sports columnist in the late 1970s. I don't think he ever imagined that he'd be doing stand-up TV hits now from the women's Final Four in Minneapolis, but there he was a couple of weeks ago doing stand-up TV hits from the women's Final Four in Minneapolis. So I think a lot of it just comes down to being able to make yourself as well-rounded as possible. And it's an ever-changing world out there.
That's the thing for us. It's so much of it's about learn the different sports, learn the different media platforms that you're going to be utilizing, know how to write, know how to edit video, know how to speak on camera or on microphone for a podcast. And you're never, there's very few people that are great at all of those things. But if you can be great at one of those things and good at the other things, you're going to go really far. And it's a tricky business because, again, 15, 20 years ago, most people were training to be newspaper writers and there was like a clear path of development, or you were training to be a news anchor or a reporter on the TV side. There's a clear path of development. Those things don't really exist to the same degree anymore. But that's what I like about our program is that we plug students into a bunch of different things. We tell them from the beginning, like, we're not going to wait until you're a junior or senior to have you start doing stuff. We want you doing stuff as a freshman. And the kids that really seize on that and take advantage of it end up doing really, really well. And Grace and Tyler are two great examples of people who started in their freshman year and then used that 4 years to develop the same way we talked about wanting basketball players to develop at the beginning of this podcast. So.
Well, Galen, thanks for the time. Good to catch up with you. I know you're busy with Little Five this week and a lot of other things going on campus, so I appreciate you carving out the time. As for Podcast on the Brink, we'll be back again next week with another episode. If you enjoy the show, as always, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Also now on Spotify, you can leave the show a rating. I've noticed a couple people have done that over the past week. We really appreciate it. And once again, we'll talk to you next week, and we'll be back with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.